Let's talk about trees. Now in this tutorial I'll be showing you how to paint and draw simple trees in watercolor and ink. Now there's no getting around it. If you're really interested in on-location art creation, you will have to include trees and nature into your pictures at some point. And in this tutorial I'm going to show you how. There'll be 3 stages to this. The first one, I will be just showing you a few examples of trees in the real world. We'll be learning how to analyze them, understand the composition. Secondly, I'll be giving you the techniques for how to paint and draw them. First up, we'll be looking at how to paint different kinds of trees using different kinds of brush and watercolor techniques like this. I'll also be showing you my ink pen, showing you how I draw trees. So here's a few examples here. And finally, we'll be bringing it all together by painting a more complicated tree like this one here, looking at all the different shadows, the different brush strokes and ink techniques. Now, as always, all of the equipment and tools I'm using will be listed in the description below. So to get started, let's take a look at a few examples of trees and let's understand their structure and how they work. First up, let's look at this tree here. Nice, simple autumn tree by itself. Now, I like to look at trees in terms of structure, in terms of shape. So let's look at the shape of this tree. It's not quite a circle, it's more like a semicircle. You've got the trunk in the middle with branches, but really I want to look at this tree as one single object. So we're not looking at it in leaves or branches, we're just looking at the overall shape. Now, although it's got this nice shape, you can see it does have some areas where the sky is poking through. So as long as we remember to paint those in, we'll be good. Now, after I've looked at shape and structure, I like to look at light. Light is what gives the tree that structure. So you can see here it's coming from the top right, hitting the top of the tree. A typical rule is that trees tend to be lighter at the top and darker at the bottom. So even though the light is coming and hitting the edge of this tree, you can see at the bottom, or kind of in the middle of this case, it is a lot darker. And it kind of fades a little bit, but in general, you've got that dividing line, light on the right and dark on the left. So again, we just need to remember this. Shape, and then the light is what gives the tree that shape. Now, let's look at another example, slightly simpler, and it's a bit easier to identify the shape with this one here. Nice, simple tree. And again, it follows that rule, which is that you've got a nice dark base of the tree where you can see the trunk is, and then it's lighter on the top. Again, light is coming from the top right, and it's that light hitting the top of that tree there that gives it structure. So you can see it's kind of more of like a diagonal line here where the light is hitting the right and it's dark on the left. Now let's take a slightly different example. These are trees from Tuscany, and the defining feature of them is they got these points, but you can see they're grouped together. Now what does that mean? That means that when we paint them, we can paint them again as a single object. So if we're looking at this, we can group them together, and as long as we still have those points, your eye will recognize them as a single tree. Now, what about a slightly different kind of tree? What about something like a palm tree, for example? Now, slightly different structure here, and you can see that gravity is playing a role. You've got these sort of pointy parts of the tree at the top, and then as they get to the base, they kind of fan out and they droop down. You'll also notice a color change. At the bottom, the palm tree leaves are yellow because they're older, and at the top they're younger, so they're green. But I think the main thing here is the sense of gravity. These leaves at the bottom will fan out and they'll droop down more than the ones at the top. So you can see how it's really getting a sense of the different kinds of trees and the characteristics of them. Again, let's look at the trunks of these palm trees here. You can see they're not quite straight. They're kind of at an angle. And this is, again, a very, very important thing to recognize, is that tree trunks are not straight. They do operate at an angle. Now, I'm going to paint these 4 different trees in 4 different ways. Now you can see here I've pre-made this grid, 4 squares with the sky and green. Partly that's just to save time, but also I think it's important to give a bit of context to the trees. You don't want them just floating around in a weird white space. So each of these 4 sort of spaces I'm going to fill and paint with a tree. Now I'm going to paint this first rather than ink it, because I want to show you some of the specific painting techniques using this brush here. It's just a sable round brush. The exact one is in the description. And I'm going to show you the Impressionist watercolor painting techniques for just trees. I do think it's important that you understand, how to paint a tree first, then you understand how to draw it. So this is the first one we'll be doing, just the most basic tree we can get. Nice single shape. Here, you've got the light coming from the top right. We've got the trunk in the middle. So let's give this a go. Now to start off, we need to get the colors right. Now, really, when you're painting trees, you don't want just green out of the pan. The green I have here is called sap green. Really, you want a mixture of sap green, yellow ochre, maybe a bit of cadmium yellow. And this is just to replicate the kind of same colors that you might get in nature. It's really, really rare in watercolor that you can just take a green straight from the pan and have it work straight away. So first of all, let's get started mixing. So this is a bit of yellow ochre and a bit of sap green. Again, a really good go-to combination. Gets a really nice warm green. Bit of cadmium yellow. I'm sorry you can't see the mixing pan. I will move this around. And a bit of cobalt blue. I'm going to use the side of my brush, and I'm going to work where it's lightest first. So using the side, I'm just going to very, very lightly put in some individual marks here. So I'm going very loose because I do want to keep a few gaps. Now, we're going to move back in and we're going to cool this off with a bit more cobalt blue and sap green as we get closer down. So it's kind of a gradient. So same again, use the side of your brush. And you can see it's already starting to get a bit cooler. Now, I'm trying not to be too predictable when I paint this, because you do want the unpredictability of the brush strokes. Bit more cobalt blue, a bit more sap green, and we're just cooling this off now, making it darker as we get to that bottom left. There we go. I'm using a slightly different angle on my brush now. But you can already see that I'm starting to replicate the light and dark. So this is more ultramarine blue now, and this is really thickening this up. Nice, looking good. You notice I've left those gaps there. So even though they're not in the picture, you do get a sense that the light is poking through. So it looks to your eye like a tree. And as we're getting to the bottom now, we want to thicken that up even more. So maybe we can even go back in to that bottom part. So let's add a bit more ultramarine blue, just to thicken that up even more. And I'm going to put in the trunk here as well. Again, it's really, really important that the tree trunks, they're not straight. They're always typically at an angle. It's really one of the most common mistakes I see is people drawing tree trunks just as straight. They're not. And it's just a bit of the same mixture is for the shadow. I think it's important for the shadows because they ground the tree. They give it a sense of reality. And then this is a bit more of that darker mixture. So this is burnt umber, cobalt blue, and I'm just throwing that in there just to make bottom part of that tree a little bit darker. You've got to make sure to go in a bit darker here. And thicker as well, otherwise you'll get a nasty effect. So you can see where those gaps are in the tree. I'm just adding in a little bit of shadow underneath. And that's pretty much it. That's your basic Impressionist watercolor tree. And I think that looks pretty good. If we do a comparison to the original, yep, I like that. It doesn't look exactly the same, but it's our own style. Now, next one we're going to do is these Tuscany trees, the pointed ones. Now remember, this is a collection of trees, isn't it? It's not just a single tree. So I'm just cleaning off my palette now. This is really important when we're doing different kinds of trees. Here we go. I'm going to move the palette around so you can you can actually see what I'm mixing now. Sorry about that. Now the important thing with these trees is we're going to treat them as a single object, even though they are lots of different trees. Now this is a really good technique to do if you're doing trees in the background. So let's do alizarin crimson, ultramarine blue, and sap green. And what this does is create a kind of browny green. Now I'm using the tip of the brush here. I'm starting at the top. I'm adding a bit more cadmium yellow and sap green as we move down. And then I'm going to add in the other points there. A bit more alizarin crimson and a bit more ultramarine as we get to the base. So the same rule still applies. Lighter at the top and darker at the bottom. So even though I'm kind of drawing these trees rather than using the side of the brush, more ultramarine, more yellow ochre, they still do look like trees because I'm following that same light-dark rule. Now this is the kind of approach I take for trees in the background because it pushes them, because you treat them as an object. So this is a bit more of the different blues now, and I'm just throwing that in because I want a little bit more texture. Now again, it looks quite different from the reference photo. I'm just sort of interpreting this in my own way. But this is a lot more sap green, ultramarine blue. I just want to make this a lot thicker now. And again, using that brush, just add in, I'm imagining that there's a few more trees in the foreground there. So I think that looks pretty good. I mean, it does look different from the reference photo, but imagine these trees are off into the background. They might look a little bit better there. They might look a little bit weird by themselves. Now, let's clean off our palette again as we move to the third tree. Now that will be that autumn tree that we looked at. And now it's a little bit more broken up than the original one. You can see there's a lot more gaps. So I'm going to, imagine that this is a bit of a looser tree. So yellow ochre, sap green, cadmium yellow, tiny bit of cadmium orange actually. Let's put that in. And I'm going to dry off my brush on the sponge, and I'm going to very loosely use the brush here. Notice how I'm going a lot looser than the original one. I want more of those gaps, a bit more ultramarine blue, and if you want, you can even use the dry brush a bit more to dry off. And then add in a bit darker mixture here. And you can see how it creates these a lot more gaps using that dry brush effect. Now obviously once we've created those gaps, we need to put some branches in. So this is a bit of indigo, burnt umber, ultramarine blue, and this is a nice thick mixture now. I'm using the tip of the brush. I'm going to put in that trunk. Sorry, my hand is in the way there. And then I'm just going to add in a few little branches that I've just lightly thrown in here, in between the gaps. And again, that shadow. So although this doesn't look much like the reference picture, you can see I am just interpreting this kind of in my own way. And then let's just add a bit more blue to this mixture for the shadow. So with the first tree, you can see that there's not many gaps, so I don't need the branches. Whereas with this one, because I'm using the side of the brush, it creates a lot more gaps, but obviously we need to fill those gaps. Now let's look at the palm trees. Now, palm trees, as we talked about, have a lighter colors, leaves, sorry, at the bottom, and they tend to be greener at the top. So the characteristic of a palm tree is a little bit different than a normal tree. So I'm going to clean off my palette again. So let's start with a bit of cadmium yellow, a bit of sap green, and yellow ochre. These are going to be for those older leaves. And using the top of the brush, I'm just going to flick outwards really quick. So I'm going from the center of the palm tree and flicking outwards. So this is what I mean about brush work is quite important. So I get a bit more blue here, and same technique, going in from the center, flicking out. More ultramarine blue, and I'm just flicking out, and that creates that kind of nice loose palm tree effect. It's okay if you break it up a little bit. The chaos is kind of what you want when painting trees. More ultramarine blue, more burnt umber, and now I'm going to add in the trunk. Palm tree trunks tend to be a lot thinner, or they look thinner than other tree trunks, even though they may be the same. And then we can even go back in and add some more shadows to this palm tree. So using that trunk mixture, we're just going to go back in, and using that same technique, we're adding in a few shadows at the base. So even though palm trees will be more yellow leaves at the bottom, they'll still be darker at the bottom. So you need to have that yellow in the shadow. And again, I'm just using that slightly different brushwork technique to add in a very, very simple palm tree that you see there. Now, all of these do look a little bit odd in isolation. They do look a little bit strange by themselves, but I assure you, if you combine them together with a bit of ink, they'll look quite nice and they will come together. So now I'm going to show you how I like to ink these trees. Now I've already shown you the impressionist, sort of basic impressionist watercolor approach to painting. But now I'm going to paint this tree, draw this tree using my sort of standard inking technique. Now, obviously when I draw trees, it's a slightly different approach to painting. So what I like to do is I like to think in terms of shape. So I'm just drawing in the very loose shape here and the trunk. Now remember what I said about tree trunks, they always tend to be at an angle. So I'm actually going to exaggerate that angle quite a bit here. And I'm going to take my Pilot Parallel pen, and what I do is I like to start at the bottom and just doing in some little lines, sort of scratchy lines for the leaves. Now I'm not going to do this for the whole of the tree. I kind of like to do it just where there's shadow. Now it is really important to sort of vary up your different techniques here. And I'm trying to only really do them at the base. And as we get to the top, then I don't mind throwing in lines, as you see here, that are kind of broken up. And again, I'm just going back in wherever I feel could do with a few more leaves. But I do like to take this kind of very, very sparing approach to doing ink with trees. It would look very, very strange if I did every single leaf. So I like to do a few, but not all. And then I'm going to put the tree trunk in here, and I like to do a few lines to show the bark. And I'm just going back in and adding in wherever I feel might need a bit more. I'm also happy to use the side of my brush just to create a few shadows in there. And that's kind of it. You can see it's a very, very minimalist approach to drawing trees, but when combined with the impressionist painting technique, it really does give you a good sense of depth. I'm trying to find that middle ground between detail and shape. Now for these Tuscany trees, this is going to be a bit different. We're imagining that these are in the distance. So I'm just going to draw the shapes in. So I'll paint them as a single object, but I'm going to draw them separately. But I'm just going to draw the shapes. Again, a few jagged edges. It is a different kind of tree, so it's important to get those different textures in. So you can see, like I said, I'm drawing in the individual shapes, even though I will paint them as one single object. And I think this really is the difference between painting and drawing. Again, that's pretty much it. If these trees are in the distance, I don't want to give them too much detail. I don't want to draw the leaves in too much. Now, let's go to this slightly more complicated tree here. And again, I'm taking my process. I'm using the side of the brush here to create those dark shadows. And what I'm doing is I'm kind of almost drawing the shadows in. So again, this is very, very loose. Just getting in the impression of the leaves. And again, the trunk, again, at an angle. So yeah, working with the overall shape, it's a bit different than the first picture. And you know, wherever there's shadow, pagan. Remember, there are some gaps on this tree, so it's really important to get those in. And I'm just following that technique of having a few leaves, but not all of the leaves. Trust me, if you did draw all of the whole tree with this technique, it would look quite busy. It's not necessarily a problem, but it can dilute your painting a little bit. I'm using the side of the brush here just to throw in that shadow. Look at the base of the tree where it meets the trunk. It's really dark there. I've put in a nice bit of jet black. And the final one we're doing is these palm trees. Now, palm trees again is a kind of an odd shape, but I'm still angling those tree trunks in on each other. I'm really exaggerating the angle of the trunks, and that's something you can do. Now I'm putting in the trunk first, just to know where I'm coming from. And I'm kind of simulating the painting. I'm drawing out. I'm drawing a single line for those branches, and then adding the leaves on. Now with palm trees, it is important again to acknowledge the gravity. So the green leaves at the top are kind of pointing upwards, and then the ones around the sides start angling down. You can see where the gravity starts to take hold. With palm trees, it's really important to add some overlapping. Remember that a palm tree is 3D. It's not just, the branches are not just going off to the sides, they'll also be in front of you. And for the background palm tree, it's similar to the Tuscany trees actually. I'm just drawing a shape, so no leaves. And if I want to add one more, I might just do the shapes like this. So you can see that the ink work I'm doing is really mimicking my understanding of the structure of the tree. And as long as I understand the structure of the tree and how it works, it's a lot easier to do the inking. So there we go. Very, very simple ink work of those 4 different trees. Now, what's next? Well, we're going to take one of these trees and we're going to do this as a proper picture. Ink first, paint later, and we're going to do it in a lot more detail. And we just compare it to the sort of painting versions of the trees. We can see how they will eventually be combined together. So now let's move on to this final painting. Now this is going to be a full-size ink and watercolor drawing, so now we've got larger paper now. Again, I pre-made the background. This is just to save time. So let's remind ourselves of the picture we're going to be drawing. You might be familiar with this tree already, but we're going to do it in a lot more detail. And because we're doing it in more detail, we just need to recognize a few of the objects. Again, we've got the light coming in from the right, and it's also hitting the edge here. We've got this central cavity that's very, very dark, and it's really, really important that we get that in there. Notice how there's a few sharper dividing lines on the left, where it goes from light to dark, and in the middle, it's a little bit softer. But generally, this is a nice kind of warm, kind of almost like a yellowy brown more than a green. So we've got to be careful with our mixing there. But to get started, we're going to get on with the inking. Before we do that, I'm just drawing in the shapes. So using my pencil, I'm just getting in where the trunk is roughly and where those main branches are. And then I'm just drawing in a rough shape of it. You know, I don't want to get too detailed with the pencil. And I think the important thing here is just to leave that gap of light in the middle. Really, really important that you get the sky coming through, because that gives it a sense of being a tree. So this is my Pilot parallel pen, 2.4 millimeters, and I'm starting with the trunk. Now remember, the trunk is a bit of an angle, and because the trunk is a bit of a different feel, I'm going in quite angular with those lines. And once again, I'm starting in with the base and just creating kind of this very, very loose leaves. I don't really have a proper starting place when I do trees. I do tend to start at the bottom, but it could be any part of the bottom. And again, I'm just sort of playing this by ear, just looking to see where I can add some leaves and where I want to leave them out. But I do think I want to try and get in the sense of that central cavity and these branches. So I am drawing in these branches here, because I think that I do want that to be kind of the focal point. And I think having some leaves around these branches is quite important, because it just creates that sense of depth. And again, I'm following a very similar approach to that initial picture, is that it's, I am drawing the sort of the overall shape of the tree around the edges, but at the bottom I'm just adding in those leaves. And again at the top, let's just add a few more here, and then using the edge of the brush to create the big outline of the tree. So because we're doing this tree in a lot more detail than the other ones, I'm spending a little bit more time just trying to identify where the bases are. So remember, there is not just one base to a tree, there are multiple bases. As you can see inside the central cavity, we have a few more darker sections. And again, the outside here. It's important to be a little bit unpredictable with your pen strokes here. You don't want the drawing of the leaves to be too uniform. You want to change the direction, change the speed, change the style, and this will help all of your leaves seem a bit more natural. Same thing with the strokes for the trunk here. I'm just adding in some lines, but they're quite nice and quite loose. And now I'm just going back in and adding in any final leaves or any dark highlights using the side of the pen. I think even if you do feel like you're drawing in too many of the leaves, that's okay. But you can see here, there's the ink. It's a bit of a nice balance already between showing the shape of the tree, but also giving a bit of detail and textures into the leaves. And I'm just going back in to really think, is there anywhere else I can add a bit more? I never know when to stop with these paintings. And a bit of the shadows here. And I think it's good to add a few little plants at the bottom, which you see I've done there, and that's just to give it, again, to give it a little bit of context. And actually, now that I look at this picture, I see those leaves on the left, they're almost touching the ground. So I'm going to do them a little bit lower. And that's looking pretty good. I think that's the ink done. So I'm pretty sure we can give this a bit of a dry off, make sure the ink is completely dry, and then we can move on to the painting. So I'm just going to wet my palette here. Just going to remind myself of the colors here. It is quite warm, but there is some variation in that warmth. You can see it gets a little bit cooler here. The bottom, the bit of the light is hitting. So I am going to start with the light and then move my way to the darker areas. So I'm going to move my mop brush here, and this is just because it's a bigger tree. And this is yellow ochre and sap green. Again, that creates that nice warm green mixture. Bit of burnt sienna as well, because it is very warm. I'm using the edge of the brush, like we did in that first picture, the side of the brush, I should say, just to create that kind of broken effect. You can see there. And as I move towards the bottom and the edges, I am adding in different colors. We don't want the tree to be all of the same color. So more sap green, more burnt umber, sap green again, tiny bit of alizarin crimson. Notice how I'm leaving lots of white gaps. More alizarin crimson. I'm using the tip of the brush here sometimes just to create a slightly different effect. And more alizarin crimson as we move to the left. You can already get a sense of the light now, can't you? And more sap green, more cadmium yellow. Because remember, look at the photo, the light is hitting a lot of the left of that tree as well. It's really that central area which is kind of in shadow. And more cadmium orange, just to add in a slightly different color. So you can see here already we've got quite a nice gradient effect where the color of the tree changes already. That's what we want. So you can see how we're taking that same kind of impressionist watercolor painting technique for trees, and we're applying that over the top of this ink drawing. Now I'm going to add some ultramarine blue and a bit of sap green, and we're going to create a kind of shadow mixture using that same base color, and I'm throwing that in wet on wet. More ultramarine to thicken this up, more burnt umber I think, and we are just throwing it in wet on wet, and that will create a kind of a blending technique where the shadows will kind of fade. This won't be the only shadows we're doing. And more ultramarine blue just to cool it off, and we're throwing that in. Trees don't have sharp shadows like buildings. They often tend to have this kind of fuzzy, hazy effect, which we can only really get by doing this wet on wet technique. Now using tip of the brush here, just throwing in Little bit of shadows here or there. Notice how I've not painted the trunk at all yet. We'll come to that soon. Yeah, we do get that nice blended gradient effect there. So now let's add some cobalt blue, and we're going to do the tree trunk. Now, one trick I learned a few years ago is that actually sometimes it's better to do the tree trunk kind of a blue or a grey. In a weird way, they look more realistic sometimes when you do it that. So if you're struggling with trees and you're always painting this brown trunk, try using a blue or a grey. Now we're done with that first layer, so let's dry this off. It's already looking pretty good. I mean, I like how it's blending together and we get a sense of the light and the dark, but if you do compare it to the reference photo, you can see still see a kind of a sharp difference in that picture of those shadows in the middle. So what we're going to do after this is dry, we're going to go back in and add more shadows to that central area to really give it more structure. And that's all dry. It's always useful giving it a little test first to see if it is actually dry. Now I'm going back to my round brush here just for some details, and let's add in burnt umber, ultramarine blue and sap green. We're creating a shadow mixture here, and we're just using the side of the brush just to do a very light shadows. So these aren't the central cavity. If you find it's too dark, add a bit of water. And using the side of the brush here just to create that kind of unpredictable effect. And just any shadows that aren't that central area, you're just going around, like here you see on the left. Again here on the right too. It's just to create this idea that there are multiple levels of depth to this tree. Now ultramarine blue, burnt umber, sap green, just to make sure it's a green kind of shadow. And then we're going to go and move into the central area. It's looking good, so let's just keep moving to the right. We don't want too much shadow on that right area because we want it to sort of fade. But by using different strokes and using different shadows, we are getting some depth. Now let's take those branches. Ultramarine blue, burnt umber, sap green. So this is more of a grey. And a bit of burnt umber again. Actually, I'll just keep going back in with those shadows. Honestly, I really do never know when to stop when I'm doing things like this. I'm just using the tip of the brush here just to almost add some leaves to look like they're falling in the bottom. I think it really is important to vary up your brush strokes when you're doing this. And more ultramarine blue to get that nice cool grey mixture as we go back to the trunk here. Now notice how a bit of that trunk is poking out into the light. It's not all in the darkness like these ones here that are almost black, but not quite. And the darker we go now with those, the more you can see it really starts to pop. So let's add some more ultramarine and burnt umber to try and make that area even darker now. Notice how this whole area will be quite damp. It's not going to be super wet, but it will allow us to kind of mix a lot of those colors together still. And one thing I think is missing is the shadow. So I'm going to use a slightly different part of the pan and using a bit of ultramarine, alizarin crimson, a tiny bit of sap green. We're going to use the top of our brush and just go quickly just to get these loose shadows here. Again, remember, tree shadows won't be like shadows for buildings. They will be a little bit more imperfect and they will have these gaps. So I'm just mixing more of this shadow mixture here and putting that in below the tree. And again, I'm just going in to try and make this tree even darker. And the shadow is really important because it grounds the tree. It gives it a sense of weight and depth. And again, just a few more very loose marks here. Again, like I said, just to simulate the idea that the leaves and the light is breaking through those shadows. So there we go. Nice, nice simple tree there. A little bit more detail than the others, but you can clearly get a sense of light, a sense of depth. So thank you, I hope you enjoyed this tutorial video. I've left a few other reference images as normal in the description. Please go check those out. I look forward to seeing what you've created as well. Thanks again, see you next time.